I'm Robert Macfarlane. I'm a professor of literature and the environmental humanities, and I'm a writer. Welcome to my exp. So the first law of ecology, the first principle of ecology, is that everything is connected to everything else. And the walker, mountaineer, environmentalist John Muir, who is the sort of father of the American national park system, he has a line somewhere in one of his journals, I'll get it slightly wrong. He says, when we try to pick out any one thing in the universe, we find it hitched to everything else. This has always made absolute sense to me, and it's one reason why, as a writer, as a researcher, I guess it's always been important to put my body in the way of place, to visit the places I write about, to meet, to talk, to feel the weather, to understand how the parts of mountains, rivers, the people and the creatures who live in and are enabled and enlivened by them, how these things connect. And we could say that that's, if we want to take a linguistic turn on it, we could say that that's the difference between learning the lexis of a landscape, which is very important, and learning the syntax of a landscape, which is even more important. That's how these things connect. So from the very beginning of my writing, a book called Mountains of the Mind, that drew actually on, 20 years at that point of climbing, of being in the world and seeing what happens at altitude, at height, where all sorts of norms get changed, turned upside down, pristinated, scintillated by the strangeness of the upper world, of altitude. The period in which I've been living and writing has also been a period of increased disembodiment. Virtualization or digitization might be other names for what's happened. I still remember sending my first email when I was a student in Cambridge in the mid-90s, and back then I would never have imagined that I would spend, as I now do, probably 8 hours of my day at a screen, sitting, talking to the black mirror, as it were, of phone or laptop. And my experience is one of many people's. So we have lost, we might say, touch with the world, contact with the world as a daily part of lived experience. Of course, it's going on around us, and I can hear a robin singing as I'm speaking to you, and I'm aware of the turn of the seasons and the day drawing to a close. But I've always also been interested in what it means to not lose touch, how we build up relationships with what is very chillily, to my mind, and externalizingly called the environment. The environment sounds like the thing which is beyond us, outside us, surrounding us, but of course it's actually what we are always in. Within, I guess, the Western tradition, Descartes onwards through what we call the Enlightenment, there has been a tendency to think of knowledge as that which is produced from within and at some level confined by the skull, the brain. Descartes gives us the cogito, of course. I actually think Descartes had a pretty rough ride of it. He's often villainized as the father of rationalism and of dualism, but there was another Descartes, the Descartes who was very drawn by wonder. He says wonder is the first of all the passions. But broadly speaking, there has been a tendency to think of the mind as the only part of us that can know, that can produce and assess knowledge. Someone like Maurice Merleau-Ponty, the French phenomenologist who I read when I was a graduate student, undoes that binary, refuses the binary entirely, and sees knowledge as an ongoing weaving and unweaving co-production between the self and the world, between the body and the world. And he talks about when we touch the world, we are being touched back. When we press the flesh of the world's flesh is pressing ours in return. And this has always struck me as intuitively true. And so a writer who became very important to me, Nan Shepherd, the Scottish walker writer, who I don't think had read Maurice Merleau-Ponty when she was beginning to write her masterpiece about mountains and mountaineering, The Living Mountain, which she finished in the mid-40s, was coming to very, very similar conclusions. But she, instead of arriving at these conclusions within the university system, had arrived at them by walking the Cairngorm Mountains. And really that was proof of the proposition that, as Nan says, the body itself may be thought to think. I've always walked, loved walking, long distance walking, mountaineering as well. What we call the approach in climbing has always been an interesting phase to me. In, I guess, the late 2000s, I became particularly interested in the relationship between walking and knowledge, and I began several years, 5 years really, of following paths, not roads, not hard tarmac roads, but footpaths around the world, seeing where they led, seeing who they brought me into contact with, and using them as a means of navigating past, story, song, future, and ideas. And that became a book called The Old Ways. Again and again, I came across two ideas. The first is, in a way, that walking is our oldest technology. It is a kind of means of perception, and that we have used it from the very beginning. We are walking creatures, and a outgrowth of that, I suppose, is the idea that we know as we go, to borrow the phrase of Tim Ingold, the anthropologist and archaeologist, and many other things besides. And there is then a very long philosophical tradition of people, mostly men, but not only men, in fact, though that's probably less to do with walking than to do with the way philosophy has been passed down to us, who have spoken of this relationship between walking and knowledge. I like Kierkegaard's line best. I think he says something like, the mind works best at 3 miles an hour. And I think of Virginia Woolf as well. She talks about Norfolk, I think it is, being a walking, philosophizing landscape. The idea that she does part of her thinking through walking and in relationship with land and place. And this makes perfect sense to me. And there's a religious version of that in the idea of the pilgrimage. I became fascinated by pilgrimage during the years of following old paths. And there again, the idea, I think Rowan Williams' definition of pilgrimage as the place works on the pilgrim. So the destination is important, but the journey is more important. When I was growing up as a young climber, a young mountaineer, I was obsessed with the peak. I was obsessed with risk, with adventure, with probably something a bit like glory. And then I read Nan Shepherd, and that changed the ways I think about mountains, about mountaineering, indeed probably about knowledge. So Shepherd herself was mad, as she put it, for the tang of height when she was a young walker, a mountain goer in the Cairngorms in the early part of the 20th century. And then gradually she arrived at this much more philosophical, non-goal oriented relationship with the mountains. She says, I go to the mountains as I would visit a friend. She becomes as interested in passes as she is in peaks, more interested in pilgrimage than in conquest. And she also, The Living Mountain, this book that's been so important to me, is also really a book about knowledge. And she has this wonderful phrase. She says, the thing to be known grows with the knowing. So there is this sort of Ulyssian arch of knowledge that you can see, but that will always retreat in the measure that you approach it. The thing to be known grows with the knowing. So another writer very important to me, Tim Robinson, English-Irish artist, cartographer, and writer of the Aran Islands, he speaks of what he calls the delusion of a comprehensible totality. So you can never know one place, one island, one mountain massif, even one garden fully, and that we need to be at ease with partiality of knowledge, and again recognize that ignorance is its own encouragement. I've had a long interest in the mystical tradition, I guess it's called, That might be the anonymous 14th century poem, The Cloud of Unknowing, or Pseudo-Dionysus, the Syrian mystic who became so popular in the Middle Ages. And he talks about what's become known as the apophatic tradition, that there are things we cannot speak of. We can only speak of their negative, of what they are not, speaking around them. And although I grew up within Christian practice, I've never been a believer. I think if I were to follow a religion, it would be a polytheistic one and not a monotheistic one. Polytheism makes much more sense to me. And if I were to found a religion, it would probably be, like Philip Larkin's, it would probably be a religion founded on water. But it does make sense to me that there are forms of being, knowing, seeing, that dramatically exceed our capacity to articulate them, even to perceive them. And I found that very strongly with the work I've been doing on rivers, where legally in many jurisdictions people are being encouraged to imagine rivers as alive, as forces, as presences in the world. And their language's encounter with that immediately shows up language's fallibility, its shortfall in response to ideas as radical as that. So I am a landscape mystic insofar as I have always been drawn to places where language itself begins to crumble, and recognise that it is deteriorating into a kind of shatterbelt of utterance.